Well, greetings, everyone. Thank you for those of you who are on campus joining us here in Craig Chapel. Thank you for those of us joining us online from wherever the world you are. We are delighted that you have joined us for the 2023 Tipple Celebration Day. It is my honor to serve as the Dean of the Theological School here at Drew University. I'm Edwin Aponte. I've been here since June 2022. Yes, I had to stop. What year we are in? So a little bit more than 1 year, about 15 months. The Tipple Celebration Day, as many of you who are alums know, it is an annual event here at Drew Theological School. We, of course, honor the fifth president of Drew, Reverend Dr. Ezra Squire Tipple, but we also today are celebrating one of our esteemed professors who recently retired, Dr. Danna Nolan Fewell, who is the John Fletcher Hurst Professor Emerita of Hebrew Bible, and we are delighted that both Dr. Fewell and her partner David Fewell are here with us in person here in Madison, New Jersey. For our Tipple lecture this evening today, we have a very special guest, and I'm going to turn it over to the Associate Dean, Rob Seasongood, to continue to explain who we have with us.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you might be, for those who are joining us streaming, either now or recorded later. I bring you greetings from the Craig Chapel and Seminary Hall, home of Drew Theological School, which is a room right now full of alumni, students, and faculty, so y'all can shout and clap if you want. This is our house. This is the center of our house, our living room, and this has been a great day having everybody back home. And welcome home to those of you who've been away for a while. You need to fix that. As Dean Aponte said, I am the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here and everyone joining us online for the keynote for the 2023 Tipple Lecture. I'm welcoming you as friends and alumni, students, staff, colleagues. It's been a gorgeous day here in New Jersey and quite a full one. Today's Tipple festivities, as always, are an occasion for alumni and friends to gather, to reconnect with faculty and current students, to learn something about what each other's been up to, a bit of a homecoming. And today's events have indeed been rich, including a stirring chapel led by Drs. Jione and Bennett, who are here and there. It was fantastic. You should have seen here and there. Special exhibits at the Methodist archives, tours of campus, several opportunities to gather over wonderful meals. I'd like to express for all of us our thanks to the staff who worked so hard to organize everything today, particularly to Ms. Nancy Keats, assistant to the Dean Aponte, and Ms. Beth Babcock, our operations manager and assistant to the associate deans. They make all of us look smarter. Today has been a very rich celebration as well of the scholarship and service of Dr. Danna Nolan Fewell, the John Fletcher Hurst Professor of Hebrew Bible Emerita. Dr. Fewell left the faculty of Perkins School of Theology at SMU to join the faculty at Drew in the fall of 2000. As a senior appointment in Hebrew Bible, Dr. Fewell arrived fresh on the heels of the hire of Dr. Stephen Moore just a year prior. Together, they redefined biblical studies at Drew. If you were lucky enough to be here as a student during those days, and I was, you know how acutely they were a time of innovation, provocation, and reconfiguration of the standards of what biblical studies could, and honestly, frankly, should be. It was not a transformation that was universally celebrated at the time, but Dr. Fewell modeled both the grace and professionalism even as she pursued an insistent path toward new foundations, assumptions, and a relentless attention to both scholarly rigor and the ethical impact of what that reading would produce. Dr. Fewell's written extensively on biblical narrative. It's the core of her field. Indeed, among her 10 or so scholarly books to date, she's arguably produced the book on the subject in the Oxford Handbook of Biblical Narrative. Fewell explores narrative as a literary form, but also as a text whose history of interpretation, and sometimes whose core logic, grants some people voice and legitimacy and denies the same to others. She compels her own readers to examine that process, to acknowledge it, and then to choose a side. Dr. Fewell is at cellular level, I think, collaborative, partnering in her work with an array of other critical scholars and artists. To write with or be edited by Danna Fewell is, and you have to forgive me as a fellow Southerner, this is the metaphor I came up with. To partner with her is to something like singing with Emmylou Harris. You just sound better when you're working with her. But I'm sure more than a few of you are probably thinking at this point, isn't he supposed to be introducing tonight's speaker? I am, and I am. Our speaker for this keynote is the Reverend Dr. Sione Havea. His lecture is going to be entitled Reading with the Bible Matters, Options, Orpah, and you have to see the emotions. If you're aware at all of current biblical scholarship, you are certainly aware of Dr. Havea's scholarship. What you might not know, however, is that he's also one of Dr. Fewell's PhD students from her days at Perkins. His lecture tonight is a mature product of a student once lucky enough, like some of us, to have studied closely with or alongside Dr. Fewell. Dr. Havea himself is impressively productive author and editor. A select introduction to his work, and it's much too long of a list for me to detail. I would note the prodigious and challenging series, Theology in the Age of Empire. I just told him I think it's his best work. It includes titles such as Jonah, an Earth Bible Commentary, Mission and Context, People and Land, Decolonizing Theologies, Scripture and Resistance, and Vulnerability and Resistance. That's an amazing one. Body and Liberating Theologies. He's assisted the field with significant work as a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, with long leadership with the series of Semea studies, as a pivotal leader in the Islands, Islanders, and the Bible Unit. In his own biography, Sione describes himself as, quote, a co-parent for a polycultural daughter, native pastor for the Methodist Church of Tonga, senior research fellow with Trinity Theological College in New Zealand, and with the Center for Religion and Ethics and Society at Charles Sturt University in Australia. An activist on the ground and in meeting and classrooms, Sione pushes back at bullies and suckers and flips at what he calls shitsums in and around sacred text and context. So Sione is a scholar and an activist, a colleague and a friend. He's taken up to a radical degree Dr. Fewell's charge to consider what and who is produced, ignored, or enabled by and in biblical text in its history of reading. His remarks this evening will be a fine example. In his own abstract for this lecture, he writes, quoting him again, the Talanoa, storytelling or conversation, interweaves with an invitation by Danna Fewell in a world where so many children are sick, hungry, dying, abandoned, displaced, and violated, in a world where politics take precedence over matters of life and death. What difference does Bible reading make? If reading the Bible is to make a difference, we may be forced to read between the lines, looking for the ways in which children are repressed, exploited, violated, and ignored by the religious and political agendas of the biblical world and readers today. So there's a bit of an attributive construction for you of a quote within a quote of the scholar within the scholar. Opting to extend the lines of Bible beyond the rejection of Orpah and on the side of the road, this Talanoa that he gives us tonight resonates on her return with the upturn of the offspring of Moana, land, sea, sky, and underworld. The question then that occupies both Dr. Fewell and Dr. Havea is quite simply this: what happens when we read the Bible? What systems or shitsums result? But more acutely, they both ask a fairly assertive follow-up question. Now, what are you going to do about it? The amount of Dr. Fewell's scholarship in print is clear, but the real measure of its impact is to examine what sort of scholar it produces in turn. Dr. Havea's keynote for us this evening both celebrates and frankly demonstrates the quality of her work, even as it takes it further just the way she taught him to do. Dr. Havea.
Korege hufanga be mwe fatap mwe fonwan fatapu ki hono tu faholo fatapu ke te motol o kuiheni mong motol o me mai me ngaluope. I pay my respects to the land and to the traditions of this land, to this community, and those of you who are here, as well as those of you who are tuning in on the other side of the screen. I want to thank Associate Dean Robert Susan Good and Dean Edwin Aponte and Associate Dean Tanya that I just spent the afternoon with, and to the faculty and to the staff for this opportunity and the welcome to be here at Drew. And I'm deeply, deeply honored to participate in the celebration of Professor Danna Fewell. Her contributions to the formation of students, ministers, scholars, and critics. This is one of my highlights, so many thanks to the organizers of the Tipple event. And if I may address Danna and David and your family, we also rejoice in the difference that Danna, with the support of the family, have made in and to biblical studies, especially, as we have heard from Robert, in my humble opinion, your radical reweaving of literary, narrative, and feminist criticisms with the passion of a very proud mother who has the courage to upset the circle of sovereignty in the academy. Being one of your students from SMU, I want to say that I offer this lecture on behalf of all your students, past and present and emerging, dead and living, students who gleaned in your field, who were uncovered by your stealthy approach, and who did not return empty-handed to our homes and our communities. So on behalf of your students, Malo Aupito. I've changed the title to include emotions. This is one of the tags that's coming from the activists in the Pacific, that our emotions are reflecting our ocean. Our emotions have to do with our ocean. Danna and her colleagues will tell you that I am more interested in reading and playing with text than in explaining theories and the views of mainline readers. And this does not always go well with editors and the gatekeepers of the circle of sovereignty in the academy. And I apologize that I don't do lectures in the traditional sense. I have to stay to a script, so I need to stop around 30 minutes from now. I don't do lectures, but I make presentations, or Althea might say that I make up presentations in the native mode of Talanoa. Talanoa is this term in our world that has three meanings. If you have a story, the story is Talanoa. When you tell, the act of telling is also Talanoa. And when you have a conversation where you offer alternative stories, or you tell it differently, or you push back at the Talanoa that has been done, that's also Talanoa. So I follow this process of Talanoa, which basically means that I will weave a few stories and concerns to invite you to remember some of your stories and concerns, to help you talk back to me, to offer alternative weavings and I welcome interruptions. But if you interrupt me, I might just ignore because of the time limit. If you don't interrupt me, this is my way of inviting you, I plan to Talanoa in 30 Pacifica minutes, which can go for days and days. But I will stop, so there is time for us to engage. For this evening, for this occasion, I revisit a story with which Danna is very familiar, and I'm expecting that others are also very familiar with this, circling around the moment when 3 migrating widows paused their journey on the side of the road before they parted ways. So this is my Talanoa. 3 widows went on an exodus from Moab to Judah in Canaan. They appear to travel light because the narrative does not give them helpers like some of the travelers, the older men in the Bible. They paused their journey, on the side of the road, a place that may be conceived as a biblical version of a bar, where propositions and transactions take place. So think of this as 3 widows went into a bar. Many moons earlier, Judah encountered a widow in such a place, on the side of the road. And this time, a company of 3 widows paused on the side of another road for deliberation and dissension. Since ancient times, roads have been built for the transport and trade of goods and bodies, and for the expansion of empires. Some travelers are attacked and robbed on the road, including being attacked by angels and gods. And many victims are ignored on the side of roads. Some people are called and some are circumcised on the side of some roads. And some people who have been called and circumcised abduct natives on the side of some roads. In our parts of the world, the abduction of the stolen generation of indigenous Australians involved people who were armed for the Christian mission and charged with the doctrine of discovery. The road where the 3 widows paused in this story is rather quiet. The narrative empties out this road, but in native Pacifica world and worldviews, the land has eyes, and the landscape functions as the ears of the ancestors and as registers for future generations of migrants and boundary crossers. Even if no human travelers pass by on the side of this road, the context would have seen, heard, and remembered the exchange between the 3 women. Konai Helu Thaman's poem, The Way Ahead, captures the interweaving of Pacifica landscape and worldviews.
We cannot see far into the distance. Neither can we see what used to stand there. But today, we can see trees separated by wind and air, and if we dare to look beneath the soil, we will find roots reaching out for each other, and in their silent intertwining, create the hidden landscape of the future.
The company of 3 widows paused on the side of an emptied road. And as they parted company, Naomi tagged Orpah as the sister-in-law who returned to her people and her God. Sorry, this is not working. Naomi's tag depicts Orpah as a disloyal, regressing, bad Moabite woman. With this Talanoa, I wonder if she could be re-tagged as a badass woman. Returning to her people and her gods was not Orpah's first choice. She was compelled to return when it became obvious that Naomi did not want her and Ruth to reach Judah. Naomi used Ruth and Orpah to cover up her flight from Moab, but she did not want them for her re-entry into Judah. On a route and landscape that have heard the cries of diselected people, Ruth and Orpah were unwanted company for Naomi. Out of Moab, Ruth and Orpah walked into the space of liminality that has received the cursed bodies and crushed dreams of an earlier unwanted Exodus generation. The three widows paused, and Naomi kissed Orpah and Ruth goodbye. They wept aloud. Then the two daughters-in-law talked back against their mother-in-law. They both wanted to go all the way and to join Naomi's people. Their first response was to dissent. Then Naomi countered. Naomi insisted that Orpah and Ruth go back to Moab. This second time, Naomi must have raised her voice as she preached about what they would not get if they went with her. She admitted that she was old and she was bitter because the hand of the Lord had turned against her. And she was not certain that she would bear more sons to later become their husbands. Again, they wept aloud. Then Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye, and she was escorted out of the narrative by the words of Naomi, which were directed at Ruth. Look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. That's the NIV. Twice Naomi pushed Ruth and Orpah to return home, and twice they wept aloud because they did not want to leave their mother-in-law on the side of the road between places. Or did they weep aloud also because of the pain of rejection, of not being welcome into Naomi's people? Did they weep aloud also because of the agony of having been denied arrival, of having been used for someone else's interests, or of having been pushed back in between their mother's home and their mother-in-law's homeland? Twice they wept loudly, and their weeping brings to mind two earlier instances of departure. Departure from their mother's home and departure from their homeland. First, the first departure, Ruth and Orpah left their mother's home when they were taken as wives for Naomi's sons. This was after the death of Elimelech, and I suspect that Naomi had a say in the selection of her daughters-in-law. As natives of Moab, Orpah and Ruth would have had access to land and resources that benefited Naomi and her sickly and weakly sons. By marriage, Ruth and Orpah figuratively left their mother's home. But it is very likely, in my native mind, that the sons of Naomi, as refugees to Moab, moved in with the families of Ruth and Orpah, as did Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, and Jacob before them. In this regard, Ruth and Orpah did not physically leave their mother's home until Naomi decided to return to Judah. The second departure was when Orpah and Ruth were made to depart from their homeland when Naomi took them out of Moab. Their exodus was a physical departure with cultural and religious implications. They were also departing from their people and their gods. So when they paused on the side of the road, Naomi told Orpah and Ruth to return to the home and homeland, to return to the people and gods that she herself made them leave. On the side of the road, these two widows could have felt the pain of commuters who are pushed off a train before they reach their destination. And I'm thinking of the trains in Asia and Africa. I think the trains here are more, you have more space here. But in Africa and in Asia, they hang out the door so you get pumped out easily. On the side of the road, they could have felt the vulnerability of foreigners who miss a connecting flight. On the side of the road, they could have felt the fear of slaves who were pushed off the boat so that the slave trader could claim their insurance. On the side of the road, they could have smelled the anxieties of many refugees who are denied entry and hope. Did Ruth and Orpah weep loudly also because of the agonies of rejection and denial? The company of three left Moab as widows, and waiting in Judah were the home and inheritance of their deceased husbands. As widows, they all had rights to claim what belonged to their dead husbands. They left Moab as widows, and they would have expected to gain something in Judah. There was an economic motive for Naomi's return, in a story in which inheritance, harvest, and food are the currencies. But on the side of the road, like when the angel blocked the way of Balaam's ass, Naomi attempts to block Ruth and Orpah from reaching the gate in Judah where economic transactions are formalized. In this light, on the side of the road, Naomi is a hidden capitalist who wanted to consolidate all of the reserves and interest into her private trust. Naomi's capitalist mindset is contrary to the relational and reciprocal cultures that Samoans call tama o ainga. Tama refers to a person, ainga refers to relations. So a person is always operating in the relation, similar to Ubuntu. The root term here is ainga, which according to the Samoan theologian Ezra, it's one of the strongest economic units within the Samoa, within the Samoan way. It is a place of solidarity for all family members. In the Samoan context, Tamao Ainga emphasizes the values of reciprocity, sharing, and mutual support as essential elements within the Samoan economic affairs. In the Samoan context, and in other relational and reciprocal cultures, Naomi's block on Orpah and Ruth are bad and ruthless. On the side of the road, Ruth and Orpah had only two options. They could push back in order to go along with a bitter mother-in-law who did not want them with her, or they could concede and risk being discredited by a narrative that has been relocated to entice allegiance to the flag and lineage of the Lion of Judah. The co-sisters-in-law parted ways. Ruth went on to give her womb for the favor of Judah's people and gods, and put her name on the title of the book, while Orpah returned to her people and gods. And as the three widows parted on the side of the road, the narrative pushes readers to celebrate Ruth, but forget Orpah. Readers have options. Readers have more options than Ruth and Orpah. To repeat an established position, the options that we take as readers are conditioned by many factors, including our gender, class, race, caste, sexuality, ability, age, upbringing, cultures, desires, fears, bodies, looks, and so forth. Those conditions make us notice or not notice some textual details, make us warm or not so warm to some characters, depending on where they stand or walk on this or the other side, and make us condemn or justify or just completely ignore who says or does what. Many of us who studied with Danna, as a teacher, advisor, colleague, and author, appreciate the options that she advocated for reading between the lines, for reading between texts, and for reading against the grain. We readers have options, and we are biased and interested with many hidden ideologies and blind spots. And our challenge, as our 9-year-old daughter puts it, is to make the right decision and to do the right thing. The challenge for our daughter is, of course, easier to ascertain when it has to do with eating vegetables and wearing underwear. The kind of opinions that kids like to sabotage. We older folk are smarter at analyzing our options, and we are better at hiding our idiosyncrasies, right? The options we take make a difference in the way we operate in biblical and theological education. When I started as a student, I was deemed to be acceptable if I kept my scholarship free of my commitments. The letter could be aired out in the pulpit, but they did not belong then in the halls of proper biblical studies. Praxis was the stuff of liberation theology and liberation hermeneutics, but those were not considered proper theology in those days. I'm trained, I'm hoping things have changed. I was trained to be organic on the side of the road and after hours, but to be traditional in the classroom. You can tell that they didn't succeed. These divisions go against the land and landscape, the world and worldview of Pacifica. Clark Tusani, another Samoan theologian, recently explained how the approach of Christian missionaries to formal education insulted the traditional Samoan ways and modes of learning. He used the faleo to illustrate his point. The faleo is a house at the back of the home where parents and elders gather to teach young people what to do, how, and why. The faleo is a place of learning, and it does not have permanent walls, so that warm breeze, annoying insects, and other nosy people, neighbors, may join the learning experience, which is conducted through Talanoa. And at the end of each session, the young people would have learned to do one task in relation to a myriad of other tasks and traditions. And the best of all, I wanted to say that in a Methodist place, is that at the end of the learning session, tasks would have been completed. So there was a practical side to learning. The next generation learn, and tasks are done for the family and the village. The space of the faleo and the spirit of learning were open and free-flowing. Then the missionaries came. They built walls and rooms for different subjects. And as a consequence, learning became compartmentalized and formalized. Before the missionaries, learning was a meeting point of many subjects and agendas, seen and learned in practical ways. With the missionaries, the classroom was separated from other sectors of life. The faleo model is one native Pacifica version for intersectional learning. Our versions are different from how intersectionality is conceived and practiced here in the United States, where the Black Lives Matter and woke movements rightly and justly require intersectionality to hover over the matters of race. Here in the US, being badass requires exposing and upsetting the myths of whiteness and troubling the politics of race. We also have racism in Pacifica societies, and we continue to struggle with the legacies of Western colonization, especially in our governments, which at independence adopted the Westminster system, and also in our churches, which are still pinned under missionary positions. Our governments and churches are the protectors of the myths of whiteness. Our own people are now our colonizers. As the Fijian activist Mariana Waka argues in her poem, Paradise. I'm sorry, I didn't know that I was going to present this in a chapel. So please pardon the language. But I need to do justice to this young woman's inspiration. Meet the new lines of colonizers. They sell their mothers to save their own interests. They look like you and me, talk like you and me, but don't give two fucks about you and me. In Mariana's mind, being badass requires that we also call out those who look like us, but they sell their mothers and they don't give a damn about the rest of us. At independence, some of our native people, brown and black, became our colonizers. In the company of Ezra, Clark, and Mariana, I return to the matter of options. As readers, we have options, whether to pause on the side of the road and whether to see the elephants in the text. This Talanoa invites us, with or without underwear, to engage Orpah and her mother for their own interests, and to also be concerned about the rest of us. In the eyes of the Judean narrator, Orpah chose the wrong option. She was a bad woman. Without another word, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. Then the focus of the narrative cleaves to the words and body of Ruth. The narrative silences Orpah and pits her goodbye kiss against Ruth's cleaving words and body. Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye, but she did not kiss Ruth also. She may have seen Ruth as inseparable from Naomi, or she may have expected Ruth to return with her to Moab, to their people and their God. Whatever the reason, the goodbye kiss marks the point of separation between Ruth and Orpah. Her kiss is a marker for readers that widows are not all the same. Moabite women are not all the same, and that there are different kinds of Moabites. Orpah is not the same kind of Moabite woman as Ruth, a resolution that we have learned from James Baldwin and other badass folk. Orpah's kiss should not be confused with the other kisses in the biblical account, such as the kiss of a lover or a kiss of a betrayer. Orpah returned Naomi's earlier kiss, and both kisses are about departure. Mark separation and departure. And as Orpah falls into the cracks of the text, I expect her unnamed mother to be prepared to welcome her back to her people and her gods. From a Tamau Ainga context, I imagine the mother coming to receive Orpah and giving her what Maori call hongi, which involves the foreheads touching, the noses pressing, and the inhaling of the scent, the breath, the life, the story in the other body. The mother may even put a robe around Orpah, then prepare food for her, but after telling her off for leaving in the first place. Telling off is also part of Talanoa and Faleo scenery. Hongi is a welcome kiss that announces acceptance and spells R-E-S-P-E-C-T. Hongi marks the coming together of bodies, of faces, and lives with their Talanoa and whakapapa. Whakapapa is genealogy. It's about ainga, about relations. The hongi kiss is about receiving and arrival rather than giving and departure. And in receiving the breath and life of another, in native context where the eyes of the land and the ears of the landscape are agents in remembering and restoring, it is possible in our world for the dust of the earth and for dry bones to awake with meaning and purpose. Orpah's return would have stirred her neighborhood, and the women and children would have come to hongi her into the breaths of the community with her people and her gods. Hongi is a Maori practice, but Orpah's people and gods were Moabites. So my Talanoa frees Orpah and her mother from the intentions of the Judean narrative and narrator. I have taken this option for three main reasons. First, because I want to register that a mother's house is a place that welcomes daughters, including used and unwanted daughters, and not just a place from where daughters are taken into marriage. This Talanoa thus pushes back against a patriarchal tendency to sexualize the mother's house. Second, because I want to protect the I want to protest the remembering of the homecoming of one widow, Naomi, while the return and homecoming of another widow, Orpah, is narratively ended at the side of the road. Given the racial difference between these two widows, this Talanoa also calls attention to the politics of race in this biblical story. Third, because I want to call attention to currents of biblical studies in Pacifica. Since the 1960s, marked by the establishment of the Pacific Conference of Churches and the Pacific Theological College, from where Gladson came, native Pacifica Islanders have been encouraged to read in native ways in order to answer our questions and our concerns, instead of us answering the questions and serving the concerns of other people. Three overlapping energies in biblical criticism have since emerged. First was an initial push to define Pacific hermeneutics, with emphasis on identity in two ways. We tried to show that we can use the tools of the master. We can use historical criticism, literary criticism, all those criticisms that you probably still learn here in this place. We wanted to show that we can use the tools of the master. And we also wanted to showcase our own tools, how to read with the sea, with the land, how to read for our ancestors, how to serve, how to feast and to celebrate. Second, we served beyond our waters into islander criticism in the context of the Society of Biblical Literature, where we reach into the Caribbean waters and other islander settings, such as colder and imperial islands in Europe, in Asia. And we have been intentional with publishing, in other words, in pushing our tools into the workshops of mainline scholarship. And third, we have recently baptized native criticisms with the courage to flip and flip at colonial scriptures and colonialist mindsets. Flip, to turn, flip at, yeah. These three energies flow together and they intersect in what we are now calling Moana criticism. Moana criticism is the confluence of the three energies of Pacific hermeneutics, islander criticism, and native criticism. These energies are evident in this Talanoa. I've offered a little bit of pacificating, a little bit of islandering, and a bit of flipping and flipping at, with and around the character of Orpah and her mother. So yes, I too am using Orpah and her mother for my interest, for my own interest, to justify the options that I have taken. My options have been shaped by the emotions of Pacifica communities with whom I did Bible studies on the Book of Ruth. They were interested in Orpah also, primarily because the narrative gives them space to imagine her afterlife. Emotions. In our Bible studies at the Solomon Islands, I received several readings. Some readings came in the form of drawings of the moment when the three widows parted ways. The readings featured Pacifica emotions with sensibilities for the ocean, and they foregrounded Ruth. I want to present two of them here. The first reading, the one to the left, presented an Orpah who was upset. Her hands behind her back. There's a posture of disappointment in the Solomon Islands, with tears running down her cheeks. Orpah faces and obliges the viewers, while Naomi and Ruth face away from the viewers. This Orpah has experienced the pain of rejection that I started with. The second group presented a happy Orpah. Her hands are up in the air, thumbs up, and gladly saying goodbye in some of the languages in the Solomon Islands. Naomi and Ruth were also happy to see Orpah leave their company. This reading of a happy parting of the way makes room for a joyous homecoming for Orpah, as I have suggested. The study groups affirmed both readings, and they did not feel it was necessary to argue for one reading to be more correct than the other. For the Solomon Islanders, the critical issue was not that the text was ambiguous and has multiple readings. Ambiguity and can't pronounce it well, polyvalency are not their argument. Rather, what matters to them was that the narrative gave them space to participate in writing and drawing the afterlives of Orpah. The gaps and fractures in the story are not problems to be resolved, but opportunities to read with the text. Let me repeat that. The gaps and fractures in the story are not problems to be resolved or to be filled, but opportunities to read with the text. I also learned from emotion folk that Orpah's decision to return to her people and to her gods can be a right decision. Hence, the critical task for Moana criticism is clear: to return our minds and our options to our people and to our gods. In that regard, and in my native head, Orpah deserves a place among the badass folk. On that note, on a personal note, I'm going to get emotional here. I'm really so grateful that Danna was on the side of the road when I was returning to my people and our gods. Thank you.
We have the time and the patience and the presence of Sione for us to offer some questions or thoughts or stories or what have you for the next little bit. So I'll turn it to you. We're going to bring a mic up to here in the front.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture. You know, in Jewish settings, we often think of the book of Ruth as a book that's opening up from the Judean perspective to the Moabite perspective. But you've taken that story and opened it up even further. So those of us from the Jewish angle are often looking in the Bible for parts of it that affirm others. And you've now given a way that had never occurred to me of affirming Orpah. So thank you.
Thought? Shana Tova. Any other thoughts? Questions?
Since no one else was hurrying to go, yeah, I mean, thank you for, you know, truly wonderful lecture. And for kind of putting us on the side of that road the whole time. You made kind of a very, you know, powerful, illuminating case for, you know, Orpah being the crucial figure for, you know, Moana hermeneutics and effectively the person to follow, you know, back to her own people and her own gods. I'm curious though, could you say a little bit more about how you see Ruth and what exactly Ruth represents for you? In other words, that other option. I'd be very interested in hearing a little more about what you see that as representing out of your, you know, Moana hermeneutic.
Yeah. Thank you. Did you?
This will change since I'm not a biblical scholar, but I am someone who grew up on an island. And I often joke with my students in a sort of sing-songy way that I learned a lot about emotion from the ocean. So I would love to hear more of your talking of emotions and how the Islanders are thinking with oceans that are threatening and yet life-giving.
So thank you. Maybe if I can start with the last, because we are really emotional people, but when we do things, others will say, "Oh, that's a beautiful dance," or it's a beautiful carving," rather than seeing our emotions in the work that we do. And what these activists are doing is find us that. And I think this is part of the struggle that we have in the academic circle, where emotions are kept and controlled, and the activists are wanting these emotions to come through. Now, it's problematic in the context of climate change, because islands are not just drifting, they're drowning, yeah? But a lot of them are saying, we're not moving. That's the M-ocean. We are not moving. We are going to engage with this. They'll probably be on the boat when the island drift. But it's affirming ocean, but realizing that ocean is a threat to our context. Thanks for the question about Ruth. I think this is maybe a question that Danna should answer, because she knows more about Ruth. But yeah, she represents a different kind of Moabite. And I think it's a Moabite that the scripture prefers. So I celebrate Ruth, but I don't want to forget Orpah. And for me, part of it is because of what the Solomon Islanders wanted to do. So I mean, yeah. I'm not sure what else to say other than to do another presentation on emotion and on Ruth, and how we need to read the Bible in order for it to open rather than close. I think the whole canonizing process has controlled us in our thinking rather than us opening the text up further. Now, there's also the problem of, biblical people talk about exegesis and eisegesis and all of that. Yeah, I mean, that's another hurdle to deal with. But I appreciate your seeing this as a way of opening up the text. Thank you.
Yeah, hello. I'm Melanie Johnson de Bafri. I teach New Testament here at Giroux. And I wanted to ask you to share a little bit about, I appreciate the introduction at the end of the criticisms that are developing and their kind of how they relate and build on and build from each other. But you also mentioned eisegesis, exegesis, you mentioned historical criticism, you mentioned the ways in which the academy has historically both trained and disciplined its scholars. So I'm wondering what the training of doctoral students could be, might be, should be in your visions, and right, so that the criticisms are not add-ons and not speaking against necessarily. I just would love to hear you talk a little bit about the training of biblical scholars going, in a vision and how it should be.
Oh my. Let me say first that I'm not going to answer it, because when the missionaries came, they told us how we should think and do things. So I don't want to tell you how it should be done. So but if our 9-year-old was coming for studies here, I would like her training to be different. Well, not the part where Danna was involved. Different in the sense that I think I would like for her to learn the tradition. I'd like for her to learn the main line, but to give, for whoever is going to train her, to give her more space to learn how to be a badass. Yeah, how to be comfortable about doing what the masters say is wrong. Yeah, so that's. I'd love for her to come and spend some time with Althea and you and this group, and learn the tradition before she tries to flip the tradition. Yeah, you need to learn the tradition. And I guess I'm saying students here, sorry you have to go through this process of learning the tradition, but learn the tradition before you flip. I'm only able to flip and flip at because I had to go through the pain of learning the tradition. But I didn't, Danna gave me that space, yeah, at SMU. Danna will tell you that my other professors did not give me that kind of space. So if our daughter was coming through, yeah, I hope that her mentors will give her space to go back to her gods, yeah, to learn the gods of the Bible, but to go back to her gods as well. Thank you.
Hi, I'll be quick. I'm Reggie Steele, a recent graduate. I appreciate the space of otherness that you presented in your presentation. And because the concept of otherness is both specific and general, in your view, why is, or how important is it for the narrative of the other that is not a working representation of what's normative? Why is that important? Because there are a lot of people, whether we are African American, whether we are same gender loving, that our narrative, while creative, doesn't necessarily get a working opportunity to be canonized. So why is it vitally important in your experiences to make sure that we are creative to keep the traditions of the other so that we can celebrate the stories that are not necessarily told?
Thank you. That's a really powerful question. And part of it is because Danna will tell you that I wasn't fully embraced in the theological school. So yeah, it's people like you and others here, minoritized people. That's why it's important that we need to tell that story. As you were raising your question, I'm also thinking of a painful story that Randy Bailey shared with me on how the African Americans have lost their connection with their gods, yeah, and their stories. So how will they reconnect? And at lunch today, I was learning about the Native Americans in this part and their stories. So why is it important? Because, yeah, those stories need to find their way into a theological school that was built on the backs of black bodies who were slaves. If only that, I would say, yeah, that's why we need to read for the other. Because our institutions, our privileges have benefited from those bodies, those others. I don't know if I've yeah.
I'm afraid we can continue the conversation, but the time for our broadcast and other things is coming to an end. So I wanted to make sure we all had an opportunity to thank Dr. Havea. And perhaps as a cap for the day, to thank Dr. Fewell. Danna, would you like a last word, or are we done?
Well, I would like to say thank you for all of you who came. So it's been great to see you.
And thank you. I think we have our work done here. There's classes that are going to start in a couple minutes, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't tell you how to get in there. So thank you, everyone, and let's continue some conversation as we keep going. Thank you.